Nobody could say that Scott Lee Kimball had an easy upbringing. His parents divorced around the time he was 10, and Scott, with his brother, moved into their grandmother's mobile home. It's here where their neighbor, Theodore Payton, entered Scott's life and began more than a decade of sexual abuse. Before Payton was brought to justice, Scott had sought escape at the end of a barrel in a suicide attempt that left him with a distinct scar on his forehead, and by the accounts of those close to him, a change in the way his brain worked. Before and after this attempt, Scott had already been running into trouble with the law. Check fraud and scams soured his relationship with Larissa Hintz, who he had married in 1993 and fathered 2 sons with. An allegation of sexual assault from Hintz led to a divorce, but it was a previous probation violation that actually led to his arrest. When the FBI apprehended him, he had already fled to Alaska, fallen into another engagement, and restarted his scams. In prison, Scott quickly used whatever intel he could gather among inmates and staff to his benefit. He built up his reputation and convinced a member of the FBI, named Carl Schlaff, to use him as an informant. Between poor background checks that left overlooked rape allegations against Scott out of the consideration, and Scott's ability to enter certain cliques in the prison to gather information, Schlaff accepted, a decision that now defines his career in all the worst ways. So for a very brief recap up to this point, Scott Lee Kimball was abused sexually as a child by a neighbor. He attempted suicide from the trauma related to that. The injury to his brain from the suicide attempt, his friends and family say, altered his personality and decision-making. He was never really on the right side of the law at any point in his life. He was married and then divorced after a sexual assault, arrested by the FBI, put into prison, and while in prison, infiltrated certain groups to his advantage. He used this sneaky ability to partner with the FBI to become an informant. Scott Kimball left prison with a pretty good deal, skirting a tougher penalty. His mother and brother financially supported his new businesses. The FBI also put him on their payroll, with a hefty first payment of $50,000. Leanne Emery's name had been given to Scott by another inmate, her boyfriend, Steve Holly. The three had embellished long discussions about a wild escape plan back when Scott was still in custody. After his release, Scott met with Leanne. With her boyfriend still behind bars and a long history of struggles with her bipolar disorder, Scott quickly pulled her into his world of deceit. The last time she saw her parents, she claimed she was going to Mexico. But the real story is she was going on a cross-state road trip stealing checks with Scott. When her abandoned car was found and her parents reported her missing, all police seemed to see was a troubled young woman who had decided to run off and might return at her own discretion. Scott knew, of course, that Leanne would never be coming home. He had, after all, shot her in the head and seemed pretty certain about getting away with it. His responsibilities as an informant also led Scott to a lady named Jennifer Markham. Under the supervision of Schlaff, Scott was instructed to gain her trust to lead to a criminal partner of another kingpin serving time at the prison. A dinner date that Scott recorded helped little in forwarding the case, only for Jennifer Markham to disappear shortly afterwards. When Scott made contact again after days of silence, he insisted that he knew nothing about what happened to Jennifer. As often was the case with Scott, he was lying. But given Markham's own troubled circumstances and connections to violent criminals, little came of it. Scott's association with the FBI was one of the many things about him that impressed Lori McLeod. Of course, when he gave her his number, she bought into another lie, one where he represented himself not as an informant, but as a bona fide agent for the FBI. Scott Kimball slowly entered her life, meeting Lori's 19-year-old daughter, Casey. Casey was troubled, much like the others had been, and when she disappeared, the police were again slow to investigate. Lori was not as quickly dissuaded, and Scott seemed to realize this could be a problem. He needed to throw off suspicion from himself and ease Lori's mind, and he did that with an engagement ring. The wedding was quick, and the honeymoon romantic. What Lori didn't know at the time was just a few miles out from where they were camping, her daughter's remains were in the soil. buried there by Scott Lee Kimball. The next few years would see Scott changing his targets from vulnerable women to next of kin. One of his two sons from his previous marriage to Larissa Hintz, he had a clear favorite in Cody Kimball, and he seemed to resent Justin Kimball enough to want to kill him. An incident where Scott had severely injured Justin enough to be hospitalized raised serious suspicions in Scott's mother, who believed he had tried to kill his own child to claim the insurance money. There obviously isn't enough time to go into this attempted murder of his own son, but I'll put a link to that story in the show notes of this episode. Scott Kimball's uncle Terry came to visit his nephew one day and then disappeared shortly thereafter. Scott's wife Lori walked in to see her husband putting a couch onto the curb. His statements weren't convincing, that the stain on it had been from a dog, and that Terry had escaped to Mexico with a stripper and some lottery winnings. It was a pretty bad lie, especially from someone as talented as deception as Scott. That wasn't his best work. But for Lori, the relationship was already at its breaking point. Scott had already started seeing a waitress, and his unwillingness to discuss Lori's still missing daughter had all but concluded. Scott moved out, and between his frauds and the murders, it would only take a single pull at one of the many threads to unravel everything. That pull came in Lafayette in 2006 when an optometrist realized that there was something off with his bank account. The bank called on Detective Gary Thatcher to investigate, and Scott Kimball was seen on security cameras as the person making a deposit into the account. Thatcher first spoke to Lori McLeod. Among the multiple claims of fraud she revealed, she also brought up that Scott was an FBI agent. That lie from so many years ago stuck out to Thatcher, who quickly confirmed it to be false. Along with the mentions of Casey's disappearance and the incident that had nearly claimed Justin's life, it seemed long overdue to give Scott a second look. When the day of his arrest came, Kimball didn't go graciously. He put his foot on the pedal, instigating a long chase, threatening to take his own life in a long phone call with Schlaff. All for nothing. His gas tank finally ran out in the town of Mecca, and his car came to a halt. It seemed like the truth had finally caught up to Scott Lee Kimball. Over the course of the next few weeks, Scott insisted that he was innocent in the face of increasingly incriminating revelations, including Casey McLeod's body being found after Scott claimed she OD'd in a national forest. A deal was offered. If Scott Kimball came clean and showed them the bodies of the other individuals who he was highly suspected of killing, he'd be charged on only one count of second-degree murder. Scott accepted, leading them to the remains of Leanne Emery and Terry Kimball. He then claimed he didn't remember where he had left Jennifer Markham's body, and that meant the deal was off. In prison, Scott was not remorseful. Just the opposite. He bragged about it. He bragged about more victims, some of which the FBI began to take seriously. Among these were Katrina Powell, a sex worker whose body had been found in a dumpster behind a mall in 2004 with both hands cut off. There was also Lena Reyes Geddes, whose hands were cut off like Powell's had been. In West Mesa, Albuquerque, there was also the possibility that Kimball could be tied to a mass burial pit holding the remains of 9 women. Today, the case is still a visible scar on law enforcement, both local and federal. Reforming the informant system was an obvious first step, and eyes fell on those Colorado departments that had so quickly dismissed the urgency of looking for female victims just because they had somewhat of a sketchy background. Schlaff found himself under heavy scrutiny. Although he was only suspended 3 weeks, he eventually left the FBI due to difficulty with being assigned to other cases. For Scott Kimball himself, a 2011 letter he sent to his family was significant, not only because it seemed his most detailed descriptions of the deaths yet, but also because it contained another admission of guilt. He said that he was in fact responsible for Emery's death, shooting her twice when she tried to run from him. For Casey and Jennifer Markham, he was less remorseful, still blaming their deaths on accidental drug overdoses. Today, Scott Lee Kimball is unmasked in a way he might never have expected for himself. In interviews from prison, he continues to jump from one story to the next. Sometimes he reveals something new, oftentimes he outright contradicts what he had said before. But with every lie, Scott Lee Kimball bolsters another truth about himself, that he is a killer and a con artist through and through. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and I really appreciate you taking the time to listen today. And as I mentioned in the middle of the story, in the show notes, you're going to find the news story. I think it's from 2020. They interviewed Scott Lee Kimball's two sons. One of them he tried to kill, allegedly. There's an interview with both sons there, and I'll put the link for that in the show notes of this episode, and I'll also post it on the Facebook page for 10-Minute Murder. And hey, if this is your first time listening to 10-Minute Murder, I hope you enjoyed it, and if you do, please subscribe so that you can catch up on all the back episodes and never miss any of the new ones. And connect on social media as well. You can follow along and figure out what's happening with the podcast when the episodes get posted, and also the visuals that go along with the episodes. If you'd like to contact me for any reason whatsoever, joe@10minutemurder.com. Thank you for listening today. Bye.